They say a man can own land, but sometimes the land is just waiting for him to prove he never did. The sun sat high over Carter Ranch, burning the dust into a dull gold that stretched for miles, and right in the middle of it stood William Carter, boots planted firm, shadow long and sharp like a fence line drawn across everything he believed belonged to him. And in front of him, bent with age but not with weakness, stood an old Apache man named Elias Red Hawk, his hands steady despite the years, holding a small tin cup of water like it carried more weight than it should. And for a moment, just a moment, the wind held its breath as if even it was waiting to see what kind of man Carter really was. But Carter didn't hesitate, not even a second. His boot came forward and struck the cup clean from Elias's hands, the water spilling into the dry earth before it could touch his lips, disappearing so fast it was like it had never existed at all. "You drink when I say you drink," Carter said, voice flat, not loud, just certain, the kind of certainty that comes from never being questioned, never being told no. And around them, a few ranch hands shifted, watching without stepping in, hats low, eyes careful, because out here, a man like Carter wasn't just rich, he was the rule, and rules didn't get challenged, not by men who needed their wages, not by boys who still had something to lose, and certainly not by an old native man who looked like he had already lost everything the world could take. But Elias didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look at Carter at first. His gaze followed the water sinking into the dust, as if he was watching something far more important than a drink being wasted, something older, something remembered. And then slowly, he knelt, not in defeat, not in submission, but like a man greeting something familiar, and his fingers brushed the ground until they found a small object half buried beneath the dirt, a piece of metal worn smooth by time, dull in the sunlight but heavy with meaning. And Carter saw it, frowned, and before Elias could lift it fully, Carter nudged it aside with the toe of his boot, careless, dismissive, like it was nothing more than scrap. "You people always hanging on to junk," he muttered, already turning away, already finished with the moment in his own mind. But Elias finally looked up then, and his eyes weren't angry, weren't pleading, they were steady, deep, like they were measuring something Carter couldn't see. And when he spoke, his voice came low and calm, carried just enough to reach the men nearby. "Some land don't forget its owner." And the words didn't sound like a threat, not even a warning, just a statement, like saying the sun would rise or the wind would turn, something that didn't need belief to be true. Carter gave a short laugh, shaking his head as if brushing off dust. "Only thing this land remembers is who paid for it," he said, already walking back toward his house, already done, and behind him, the ranch stretched wide and quiet, fences cutting through the horizon, cattle moving slow in the heat, everything in its place, everything under control, or at least, that's how it looked. Because as Elias Red Hawk closed his fingers around that small piece of metal and rose back to his feet, the wind picked up just enough to stir the dust again. And for the first time that day, the horses along the far fence line lifted their heads, ears turning towards something no one else could hear. And somewhere beneath the ground Carter believed he owned, something old shifted, not loud, not sudden, just enough to remind the land itself that it had been claimed long before a fence was ever built. By late afternoon, the heat settled deeper into the bones of the ranch, the kind that made even the wind feel tired, and William Carter stood on his porch with a glass of cool water in his hand, watching the land stretch out in quiet obedience, every fence straight, every gate closed, every acre exactly where he believed it belonged. And yet something about the silence felt different, not louder, not softer, just heavier, like the air itself was holding on to something it had not decided to release. And down by the lower pasture, one of the ranch hands paused mid-step, glancing toward the horizon where the desert met the sky, squinting as if trying to catch a shape that would not stay still long enough to be named. "You see that?" he asked another. But the other man only shook his head, unwilling to look too long, unwilling to find something he could not explain, because out here, explanations mattered less than survival, and survival meant not asking questions that had no answers. Carter took a slow sip of water, letting it sit in his mouth before swallowing, as if reminding himself that he had what others did not: control, comfort, certainty. And yet his eyes drifted, just for a second, to the spot where the old man had stood earlier, where the dust had swallowed that spilled water like it had been waiting for it. And he frowned, not because he understood why, but because he did not like that he noticed it at all. Inside the barn, the horses shifted, restless in a way that did not match the calm sky above. Hooves scraping softly against packed earth, heads turning toward the open doors as if listening for something carried on a wind that had not yet arrived. One of the younger workers tried to calm them, running a hand along a flank, whispering low, but the animals did not settle, their eyes wide in that quiet, knowing way that animals sometimes have when they sense what men choose to ignore. And somewhere beyond the far fence line, a faint sound drifted in, not loud enough to be called a noise, more like a memory of one, rhythmic, distant, like something tapping against the edge of hearing. Carter set his glass down on the porch rail with a soft clink, the sound sharper than it should have been, and for a moment he stood still, listening, not because he believed in anything beyond what he could see and touch, but because the land had shifted just enough to make him wonder if there was something he had missed, something small, something unimportant, like that piece of metal he had pushed aside without a second thought. He stepped off the porch and walked toward the front gate, boots pressing firm into the dirt, each step deliberate, as if the weight of his stride could remind the ground who it answered to. And when he reached the gate, he stopped, his eyes narrowing slightly, because there, carved faintly into the wood near the hinge, was a marking he had never seen before, simple lines, worn but clear, shaped with purpose rather than accident, and though he did not understand it, something about it felt older than the fence itself, older than the nails that held it together, and he reached out, running his fingers over it, expecting it to feel like nothing more than a scratch, but instead, the wood beneath his touch felt smooth, deliberate, like it had been placed there with care, not by a passing hand, but by someone who knew exactly what they were leaving behind. Behind him, one of the men called out, asking if everything was all right, but Carter did not answer right away, his gaze still fixed on the marking, his jaw tightening just slightly, not in fear, but in irritation, the kind that comes when something refuses to fit into the order he had built. And finally, he pulled his hand away and straightened, brushing the dust from his fingers as if that could remove whatever weight had settled there. Just a mark, he said, more to himself than anyone else, turning back toward the house, already deciding it meant nothing, already choosing not to see it. But as he walked, the faint rhythmic sound returned, just a little closer now, just enough to be noticed if a man was willing to listen, and the land beneath his boots held steady, quiet, patient, like it had all the time in the world to prove him wrong. The sun dipped low but never softened, casting long shadows that stretched like quiet warnings across the Carter land, and William Carter sat at his table, with a plate untouched in front of him, the food cooling faster than usual, or maybe it was just him losing interest, because his attention kept drifting to the open window where the evening air should have brought relief, but instead carried that same faint rhythm from earlier, steady now, almost like footsteps spread across miles, too far to see, too close to ignore. And outside, the ranch hands spoke in lower voices than before, not out of fear, not yet, but out of something harder to name, a shared sense that the day had not ended clean, that something unfinished had been left behind in the dust where the old man had stood. One of the younger boys, barely 16, leaned against the fence and whispered, "It feels like someone is coming." And an older man beside him shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "No," he said, voice quiet. "It feels like something already arrived." And that difference hung in the air heavier than the heat ever had. Carter pushed his chair back and stood, the legs scraping louder than they should have against the wood floor, and he stepped outside again, drawn not by curiosity, but by the need to prove to himself that everything was still where it belonged, that the land had not changed just because one old man walked across it. But as he moved toward the front gate, his stride slowed without his permission, because the marking on the wood was still there, darker now in the fading light, more visible, as if the day had only hidden it temporarily. And this time he noticed something he had missed before, a second line just beneath the first, faint but deliberate, forming a pattern that was not random, not careless, but placed with intent. And though he could not read it, something in his chest tightened in a way he could not explain. Behind him, the horses shifted again, more restless now, their movements sharper, hooves striking the ground in uneven rhythm, matching that distant sound that had grown just enough to settle into the edges of hearing, and Carter turned his head slightly, listening harder than he wanted to admit, because now it was clear, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, like something moving across the land with purpose. And for the first time, he considered the possibility that whatever it was did not care about fences, did not recognize ownership the way he did. A lantern flickered near the barn, its light swaying with the wind that had finally begun to rise, carrying with it a scent that did not belong to the ranch, something older, something dry and distant, like earth that had not been turned by a plow in generations. And Carter found himself remembering the way the old man had looked at the ground, not with anger, not with loss, but with recognition, as if the land beneath his feet had spoken to him in a language Carter had never learned. One of the men approached slowly, hat in his hands, unsure if he should speak, but finally he did. "Sir," he said, careful with the word. "There are tracks out past the north fence." Carter's eyes snapped. To him, irritation rising faster than thought. "Tracks of what?" he asked, expecting a simple answer, something he could dismiss, but the man hesitated, glancing back toward the darkening horizon. "Not cattle," he said, "and not riders neither." And that pause, that uncertainty, settled into Carter's chest like a stone, because out here, everything had a name, everything had a reason, and anything that did not fit into that order was not supposed to exist. Carter stepped forward, past the gate, past the marking he had tried to ignore, boots pressing into the cooling dirt as he followed the direction the man had pointed. And as he walked, the land seemed quieter than before, not empty, not still, but listening, waiting, and somewhere ahead, just beyond the reach of the last light, the faint rhythm continued, steady, patient, like something that did not need to rush, because it knew exactly where it was going, and exactly who it was coming for. The last light of day faded into a thin gray line along the horizon, and William Carter stopped walking not because he chose to, but because the land ahead no longer felt like something he could simply step across. The dirt beneath his boots looked the same, dry, cracked, familiar, yet there was a weight to it now, like every inch held a memory he had never been invited to share, and the tracks the ranch hand had spoken of came into view, faint at first, then clearer with each step, not deep, like cattle prints, not sharp like a rider's trail, but something in between, spaced evenly, deliberate, as if whoever made them had no need to hurry, no need to hide. Carter crouched slightly, studying them, his fingers hovering just above the ground without touching it, because something in him resisted the contact, resisted acknowledging that these marks did not belong to anything he understood. Behind him, the wind shifted direction, colder now, carrying that same distant rhythm, no longer faint, no longer uncertain, but steady, undeniable, like a heartbeat stretched across miles of open land. And the horses back at the barn let out low, uneasy sounds, not loud enough to call panic, just enough to signal that something had entered their awareness long before it reached human eyes. Carter straightened slowly, his jaw tightening as he forced himself to stand tall, to reclaim the certainty that had built everything around him. "It is nothing," he said under his breath, the words sounding thinner than he expected, as if the air itself refused to carry them with conviction. And just beyond the tracks, near a cluster of old fence posts that had weathered more seasons than Carter cared to count, he saw it. Another marking, carved deeper than the one at the gate, older in appearance, yet sharper in presence, the lines crossing in a pattern that seemed to pull the eye inward, as if it was less a symbol and more a boundary, something meant to be seen, recognized, respected. And Carter stepped closer despite himself, drawn by the same instinct that had led him to claim this land in the first place, the belief that everything visible could be owned if a man was bold enough to take it. But as he reached the post, his hand paused again, hovering in the air, because the wood did not feel like part of his ranch anymore. It felt like something placed within it, something that did not answer to him. Behind him, one of the ranch hands approached cautiously, boots slow, voice even slower. "Sir," he said, "there are more of them, all along the north side." Carter did not turn right away, his eyes fixed on the carving, tracing the lines without touching them. "More what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would not satisfy him. "Marks," the man said, swallowing slightly, same as this one. Like they have been there a long time, but we never saw them before. And that sentence hung between them, heavier than anything spoken that day, because it suggested something Carter refused to accept, that the land had not changed, that it had always been this way, waiting, unnoticed, until now. Carter finally turned, his expression hardening, not with fear, but with something closer to defiance. The kind that comes when a man realizes control is slipping and decides to grip tighter instead of letting go. "You did not see them because you were not looking," he said, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. But even as the words left his mouth, the distant rhythm grew stronger, closer, no longer something imagined, but something arriving, steady and patient, like a line being drawn across the land from horizon to horizon. And in that moment, Carter understood one thing clearly. Whatever was coming was not reacting to him. It was following its own path, one that had been set long before he ever built a fence, long before he ever placed his name on a deed. And as the wind moved through the posts, carrying that quiet, persistent sound, the land around him felt less like something he owned and more like something that had begun to remember itself. The night settled in fully, stretching across the ranch like a quiet hand pressing down on everything at once. And William Carter stood alone near the north fence long after the ranch hands had drifted back toward the house, their voices low, their steps quicker than usual, leaving him with the land he claimed to understand and the silence that no longer felt like his, and the markings along the posts seemed clearer now under the pale light of the moon, not because they had changed, but because something in him had. The lines no longer looked random or worn by time. They formed a path, a boundary, a message that did not need to be read to be felt, and the tracks in the dirt continued past each post, stretching farther than his eye could follow, disappearing into the dark where the land dipped slightly before rising again toward the open desert, and that steady rhythm, the one that had followed him since the afternoon, had settled into something undeniable, not loud, not threatening, just constant, like a drum far away, keeping time for something that had already begun. Carter exhaled slowly, forcing his shoulders back, forcing his stance to remain firm, because everything in him resisted the idea that anything on this land could exist outside his control, and yet his eyes kept returning to the ground, to the markings, to the tracks that did not belong to cattle or riders, to anything he had ever dealt with before, and he stepped forward again, crossing the line of posts, boots pressing into the dirt beyond his fence, a place he rarely walked because there had never been a reason to. The land beyond had always been considered his by default, an extension of ownership that needed no confirmation. But tonight, that assumption felt thinner, less certain, and as he moved farther out, the air changed, cooler, heavier, carrying a scent that reminded him of something he could not place, not unpleasant, just unfamiliar, like standing in a room that had been occupied long before he arrived. And ahead, just at the edge of where the moonlight reached its limit, he saw a shape, still at first, then shifting slightly as the wind moved around it. And Carter slowed, his steps measured now, not out of fear, but out of a growing awareness that he was no longer approaching something that belonged to him. And as he drew closer, the shape became clearer, a single post driven into the ground, older than the fence behind him, darker in color, worn by years that had not been counted. And at its base, the dirt was packed differently, not by hooves or wheels, but by time itself, as if this spot had been stood upon again and again long before Carter ever laid claim to the land. And carved into the wood was the same pattern he had seen before, only larger, deeper, undeniable. And this time, without thinking, he reached out and placed his hand against it. The surface cool beneath his palm, and for a moment, the steady rhythm seemed to pause, just a fraction, just enough to make the silence around him feel louder than any sound. And then it returned, stronger, closer, as if acknowledging the contact, as if marking his presence, and behind him, far back near the ranch, a lantern flickered and went out, the small light swallowed by the dark in a way that felt too precise to be coincidence. Carter pulled his hand back slowly, his breath steady but his thoughts shifting in ways he could not control. And for the first time since the old man had stood in front of him, he considered the possibility that what he had dismissed as nothing was not small at all, not insignificant, but something that had been waiting, patient, unmoved by his actions. And as he turned slightly, looking back toward his house, the distance between him and the place he called his own felt longer than it should have been, stretched by something he could not measure. And the land around him remained quiet, not empty, not still, but aware, like it was watching, like it was remembering. And somewhere in that steady, unbroken rhythm, there was a certainty that did not belong to Carter, a certainty that did not need his belief to exist. And as the wind carried it across the open ground, one thought settled into his mind, not fully formed, not yet accepted, but impossible to ignore, that this land had never been waiting for him to claim it. It had been waiting for him to step far enough away to see the truth. The rhythm did not stop when William Carter turned back toward his ranch. It followed him, steady and patient, like something that did not need to chase because it already knew where he would go. And each step he took felt heavier than the last, not from distance, but from the growing weight of something he could no longer dismiss. The fence line came back into view slowly, the posts standing where they always had, but now marked, each one carrying the same quiet symbol that had gone unnoticed for years. And as he crossed back onto what he called his land, the air shifted again, warmer, familiar, yet thinner somehow, like the comfort he once felt there had lost its depth. And in the distance, the house stood still against the night, windows dim, lanterns low, the place that had always been his center now feeling like something separate, something he was returning to rather than belonging inside of. One of the ranch hands waited near the porch, hat in hand, eyes searching Carter's face for something steady to hold on to. "Sir," he said carefully, "there are lights on the east ridge." And Carter followed his gaze, turning slowly, and there they were. Faint at first, then clearer as his eyes adjusted, small points of light spaced across the dark line of the ridge, not moving quickly, not flickering like wandering travelers, but steady, placed with intention, like markers rather than motion. And Carter felt his jaw tighten again, the familiar reaction rising in him, the need to name it, to define it, to reduce it to something he could control. "Riders," he said, more firmly than he felt. "Just riders passing through." But the man did not nod, did not agree, because the lights did not move like riders. They did not shift or cluster. They held their positions as if they had already arrived and were waiting, and behind them, deeper in the dark, the rhythm continued, no longer distant, no longer faint. Now close enough that it seemed to come from the land itself rather than from any direction. Carter stepped onto the porch, boots striking the wood with a sound that felt too sharp for the quiet around him. And he reached for the door, then paused, his hand resting on the handle as his eyes drifted once more toward the ridge, the lights still there, unchanged, unbothered by his presence. And in that stillness, a memory surfaced, uninvited, the old man's voice, calm, certain, not raised, not forced. "Some land don't forget its owner." And Carter pushed the thought away immediately, opening the door and stepping inside as if walls could restore what the open land had taken. But the room felt different, smaller somehow, the air heavier, like it had followed him in, and he poured himself another glass of water, filling it to the top, watching the surface ripple slightly before going still, and for a moment, he held it without drinking, staring at it, as if expecting it to disappear the way the earlier water had vanished into the dust. But it remained, clear, contained, obedient, and he took a slow sip, forcing himself to swallow, forcing himself to return to something normal, something he understood. Outside, the wind moved again, carrying that steady rhythm across the ranch, through the fences, past the barn, over the marked posts, and up toward the house, where the lights on the ridge remained fixed, silent, waiting. And Carter set the glass down with more force than necessary, the sound echoing briefly in the room before fading. And in that fading, he realized something he had not allowed himself to consider until now, that whatever was coming was not arriving to confront him, not arriving to challenge him. It was arriving to confirm something that had already been decided. And as he stood there, alone in the house he had built, surrounded by the land he believed he owned, the certainty he had carried for years began to thin, not breaking, not yet, but stretching just enough to let a single thought through, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore, that ownership might not be something a man declares, but something the land itself allows, and that permission, once withdrawn, does not return easily. Morning did not arrive the way it used to. It did not ease its way over the land with warmth and light. It came. Quiet, already awake, already waiting. And William Carter stepped out onto his porch before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, drawn not by habit, but by something that had settled in his chest during the night, something that had not let him rest, and the air felt still, not empty, but full in a way he could not explain, like a room where a conversation had already happened and he had walked in too late to hear it. And when he looked out across the ranch, the first thing he noticed was the fence line, every post standing straight, every marking now visible in the early light, no longer hidden by shadow, no longer easy to ignore. They stretched across the land in a pattern that felt deliberate, connected, like lines drawn on a map he had never seen, and beyond them, the ridge held its place against the sky. But the lights from the night before were gone, not faded, not moved, simply gone, as if they had never been there at all. And for a moment, Carter almost convinced himself that they had not, that the night had played tricks, that the rhythm he had heard was nothing more than wind and imagination. But then he saw the figures, not far out, not approaching fast, just standing, spaced across the edge of his land where the marked posts began, still, quiet, and waiting, and his breath slowed without his permission, not from fear, but from the realization that whatever had arrived had done so without urgency, without force, as if it had always had the right to be there. One of the ranch hands stepped up beside him, stopping just short of the porch, unwilling to come closer without being called. "Sir," he said softly. "They have been there since before sunrise," and Carter did not respond right away, his eyes fixed on the figures, counting them without meaning to. Not many, fewer than he expected, fewer than the kind of threat he had prepared himself for. And yet their presence carried more weight than numbers could explain. They did not move, did not signal, did not announce themselves. They simply stood, as if the land itself had placed them there. And Carter stepped off the porch, his boots hitting the ground with a sound that felt louder than it should have been in the still morning. And as he walked forward, the distance between him and the figures closed slowly, each step measured, each breath steady, because he refused to approach them like a man uncertain, refused to show anything but the control he had built his life upon. And as he drew closer, the details came into focus, not weapons, not raised voices, but clothing, formal, deliberate, men standing beside a wagon, papers held carefully in their hands, and among them, a figure he recognized without needing to see. Clearly, Elias Red Hawk, standing slightly apart, not leading, not following, simply present, his posture unchanged from the day before, his expression calm, as if nothing unexpected had happened at all. Carter stopped a few feet short, his eyes narrowing slightly, searching for something he could use, something he could challenge, but there was nothing to push against, no anger, no urgency, just that same quiet certainty that had unsettled him before. One of the men stepped forward then, not quickly, not aggressively, just enough to close the space between them, and he removed his hat respectfully before speaking, his voice even. "Official, Mr. Carter," he said, holding out a folded document. "We have come to discuss the status of this land." And the words settled into the air with a weight that felt heavier than any accusation, because they did not accuse, they did not threaten, they simply stated. And Carter did not take the paper right away, his eyes flicking briefly toward Elias, who met his gaze without challenge, without apology. And in that moment, Carter understood something he had not been ready to face, that whatever this was, it had not begun this morning. It had begun long before he ever placed his name on this land. And now, it had come not to argue, but to be recognized. William Carter finally reached for the document, his hand steady even as something beneath that steadiness began to shift, and the paper felt heavier than it should have. Thick, official, sealed with markings he recognized not from his land but from offices far beyond it, places where decisions were made without dust, without fences, without men like him having the final word. And he unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the lines, expecting confusion, expecting error, expecting something he could challenge. But the words were clear, deliberate, written with the kind of certainty that did not invite argument, They spoke of original boundaries, of recorded claims older than his purchase, of agreements made long before his name had ever been attached to this place. And as he read, the land around him seemed to fall quieter, as if even the wind had paused to listen. "This is a mistake," he said at last, his voice controlled, not raised, but tighter than before. And the man who had handed him the document did not react with offense or urgency. He simply reached into the wagon and brought out another set of papers, older, worn at the edges, but preserved with care. "It is not a mistake, sir," he replied evenly. "These records were filed decades ago. The land was never legally transferred, only occupied." And that word settled deeper than any accusation could have. Occupied, not owned, not earned, not granted. And Carter's jaw tightened as he looked up, his eyes moving past the official and landing on Elias Red Hawk, who stood exactly as he had before, neither advancing nor retreating, his presence quiet but undeniable. And for the first time, Carter saw not an old man, not a trespasser, but someone who had never been out of place to begin with. "You knew about this," Carter said, not asking, not accusing, just stating what had become clear, and Elias met his gaze without hesitation, his voice calm, carrying the same weight it had from the beginning. "I remembered," he said, and there was no pride in it, no satisfaction, just truth, simple and unmovable. And Carter looked back down at the papers, flipping through them faster now, searching for something that would give him ground to stand on, some flaw, some missing detail. But each page only reinforced what the last had said. Boundaries marked not by fences but by natural lines, agreements witnessed not by men like him, but by those who had lived with the land rather than over it. And behind him, the ranch hands had gathered at a distance, watching, silent, their uncertainty no longer hidden. Because what stood before them was not a confrontation, not a dispute that could be settled with raised voices or strong will. It was something else entirely, something that did not require belief to take effect. The official stepped forward slightly, his tone unchanged. "By order of the territorial authority, this land is to be returned to its original designation," he said, each word measured, each syllable final. "You will be given time to vacate, and arrangements can be made for compensation where applicable." And Carter let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a man realizes the ground beneath him has shifted in a way he cannot control, not suddenly, not violently, but completely, and his eyes moved once more across the land. The fences, the barn, the house, everything he had built standing exactly where it had always been, unchanged in form, but altered in meaning. And in that moment, the rhythm he had heard through the night seemed to settle, no longer approaching, no longer building, just present, like a heartbeat that had reached its destination. And Carter folded the papers carefully, not out of respect, but because his hands needed something to do, something steady. And when he looked back up, Elias had not moved, not stepped closer, not stepped away, simply waiting, not for permission, not for agreement, but for recognition. And Carter understood then, not all at once, not fully, but enough to feel it settle into him, that this was never about taking something back. It was about revealing what had never been given away. And as the morning light spread across the land, touching the marked posts, the distant ridge, the open ground that no longer answered to his name, the silence that followed was not empty. It was complete. William Carter did not move right away, not when the official finished speaking, not when the papers were folded back into careful hands, not even when the men beside the wagon stepped back to give space that no longer belonged to him. He simply stood there, eyes drifting across the land one more time, slower now, not measuring it, not claiming it, just seeing it. The way a man looks at something he once believed was his reflection and realizes it was only ever a shadow. And the fences stretched out as they always had, straight lines cutting through open ground. But now they looked smaller, less like boundaries and more like marks drawn by someone who did not understand the full shape of what lay beneath. And the barn stood solid against the morning light, the house behind him quiet, unchanged, yet everything felt different, not because anything had been taken away in that moment, but because something had been revealed that could not be unseen. And the ranch hands remained where they were, uncertain, watching, waiting for a reaction that did not come, because Carter had always been a man of action, of decisions made quickly and carried out without hesitation. But this was not something he could act against, not something he could push back with force or words. It simply stood, complete and unmoved, and slowly he let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to show that something inside him had shifted, not broken, not defeated, but altered in a way that did not return to what it had been before. He took a step back, then another, not retreating, not surrendering, just creating space where he had once filled everything. And as he moved, Elias Red Hawk stepped forward, not to take his place, not to claim anything aloud, but simply to walk toward the post that stood near the edge of the marked line, the older one, the one Carter had touched in the night, and Elias knelt beside it, his movements steady, familiar, like a man returning to something he had known long before it was lost to others. And from within his coat, he brought out the small piece of metal Carter had dismissed, the one that had been pushed into the dust, and he held it for a moment in the light, not displaying it, not proving anything, just acknowledging it. Then he placed it carefully at the base of the post, fitting it into the earth as if it had always belonged there. And the gesture was simple, quiet, almost easy to miss, but the effect of it settled across the land in a way that words never could, because nothing else followed, no announcement, no declaration, just that single act, done with certainty and without need for recognition. And the wind moved again, softer this time, carrying away the last trace of that steady rhythm that had filled the night, not because it had ended, but because it had completed what it came to do. And Carter watched, his eyes fixed on the old man, on the post, on the small piece of metal now resting in the ground. And for the first time, there was no resistance in his expression, no argument forming behind his gaze, just a quiet understanding, incomplete but undeniable. And after a long moment, he spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of the certainty it once carried. "Why did you not fight for it?" he asked, not out of challenge, but out of something closer to confusion. And Elias did not look up right away, his hand still resting lightly against the post, feeling the wood as if it spoke in ways Carter was only beginning to sense. And when he answered, his voice came calm, steady, the same as it had always been, because the land already would. And the words did not rise, did not echo. They settled, simple and complete. And Carter stood there a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not agreement, not approval, just acknowledgement. And he turned back toward the house, his steps slower now, measured in a way they had never been before. And behind him, the land remained as it had always been, wide, quiet, patient, no longer waiting to be claimed, only waiting to be understood. And as the sun climbed higher, casting light across the fences, the posts, the open ground that carried stories older than any name written on paper, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt earned.